You're listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, festivals we're attending, and how to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk. And now, enjoy Factual America with our host, Matthew Sherwood.
Welcome to Factual America, a podcast that explores the themes that make America unique through the lens of documentary filmmaking. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and each episode is my pleasure to interview documentary filmmakers and experts on the American experience. Today, our topic is capital punishment. As a native Texan born and raised, I can say I know it's certainly when I am overseas and living here in the UK, it is something that unfortunately people often think of when they think of my home state. They we're all a bunch of electric chair loving, gun toting nuts over there. But I think before we say any much more on that, let me welcome our guest, who is Professor Vivien Miller. She's an associate professor at the University of Nottingham. She's an expert on U.S. capital punishment. Her research interests include the history of violence, crime, and criminal justice, especially in the southeastern United States, post-Civil War era to the present, which really narrows it down, and teaches courses on the history of crime and punishment in the U.S., policing, Prohibition America, which might be another topic we talk about sometime. Has written a book on violence, crime, and executive clemency in Florida. Is developing an expertise in chain gangs. So maybe if we ever discuss Cool Hand Luke, we are documentary films, but maybe we can talk about that. And can I say, and then I'll quickly welcome you to the show. I loved you. I'm inspired by your bio because it is probably one of the most honest bios. I'm going to have to change mine. I mean, temp booking, driving tests for Department of Transport, au pair and hotel worker in Stuttgart. There's a Stuttgart reference in the film we're going to discuss today, actually.
Yes.
There's historical walking tour guide and ghost tour guide in Edinburgh, Secretary of Physics, Department at Florida State University, clerical temp for a shipping company. I mean, I'm going to be, I don't know, it's not going to play in this era of LinkedIn and everything. It doesn't really play well, but I'm going to start, I'm going to have to put in my experience as working for the Texas Highway Department, bearing roadkills on there. But it's which is probably a horrible segue if it's even a transition. But let's move to the topic today, which is capital punishment. Now, we asked, as you know. Well, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure. We always ask our guests to choose a documentary. Certainly, our academics use a lot of these use documentaries these days as part of their part of teaching their courses. And I want to thank you for introducing me to Life and Death Row. That's a series that's on BBC Three, I believe. But this one, Life and Death Row Mass Execution, we're going to narrow it down on episode 1, but there's a 4-parter. It's on, now this is late November 2019. It's still available on iPlayer for you here in the UK. And if you have a TV license, I need to throw that in. But it's, I don't know how much longer it will be there, but it's definitely worth a look. It's nominated for a BAFTA for Best Factual Series. Director is Miles Bladen Real. And enough of me talking. So, Vivien, why did you choose this film, or why do you use this when you're teaching your students?
I think it shows many of the complicated and complex issues around lethal injection and capital punishment in the contemporary United States. And it gives a sense of the emotions on both sides of the argument, pro and for, and against the death penalty. And it gives a sense of the sort of emotional toll on the condemned men and the victims' families, the kind of years of waiting for executions, then the decision to execute takes on those different actors in the system.
I mean, I was very impressed because you never know what you're going to get with some of these types of films. And from the very beginning, about how just balanced it is.
Yes.
And objective, and just showing you the emotions on both sides of all sides of the argument. So maybe for those, there's probably a lot of our listeners here and viewers have not seen it. So what's this film about?
The governor of Arkansas signed death warrants for 8 men to be executed within a 10-day period in April 2017, largely because the state's supplies of one of the 3 drugs that is used in lethal injection was about to run out. So there was time pressure to have these executions go ahead. So the film series takes you through the stories of the condemned men, their crimes, their appeals for clemency. It takes you through the different campaigning groups for and against the death penalty, and it also takes you through the kind of emotional journey of the victims' families and gives you a sense of the kind of complicated legal, moral, social, and other factors that are involved in these kind of decisions. But this was a mass execution to take place in one state, in one particular month in 2017, which made it quite a unique set of events. And it drew international as well as national attention to the state of Arkansas.
And for those, for some of our listeners who need maybe a little perspective, Arkansas is the state where Bill Clinton was governor from sort of 79 to 92 with a 2-year interruption there towards the beginning. Yet he himself has some famous cases of him going ahead and pulling the trigger, if you will, on an execution. So I think I completely agree. I think I don't know if anyone could say it any better than you've put it, but we do have a clip here of the lawyer for 3 of the inmates, because there's 8. There's a certain order. They know what order they're going to be executed in. And it's compelling. I mean, this is not the point of our conversation today, but it is compelling cinema, because I haven't watched episodes, I have to say 2 through 4 yet, but I find myself you're almost looking at it as if it's drama. And you can Google these cases and you kind of already know what's happening, but it's still compelling. So let's go to that clip of with Jeff Rosenzweig, lawyer for the 3 inmates.
Arkansas is planning to execute 8 people in a 10-day period. The rationale for this is that one of the 3 drugs they are intending to use is going to expire on April the 30th. And so there's a rush to execute them before that time. The drug companies are loath to have their products used for executions. And so the governor does not know if and when they will ever be able to get more drugs.
How long have you got until the first execution?
The first execution is April 17th. The first of my 3 clients is set for April 20th.
Stacey Johnson was convicted of the April 1st, 1993 murder of Carol Heath of D. Queen. Prosecutor Brian Cheshire says it's time for justice.
It was a very horrific murder that was done in the presence of the victim's 2 minor children that were hiding in a closet. I don't see how anybody could have a heart that could have done what this man did.
Carol Heath was found dead with her throat cut in her D. Queen duplex. Authorities say her 6-year-old daughter identified Johnson in a photo lineup. He was convicted by a jury trial twice. In both trials, he was sentenced to death.
There's no doubt in my mind this man is a very, very dangerous man and would be a danger for the same events occurring if he was allowed to be walking our streets.
Stacey Johnson's the only one of the 8 who has a serious guilt-innocence issue. The issue in his case was this. There was a child in the home who was allegedly an eyewitness. The question is, was she?
So I think that gives you an idea of what this is all about. I think for me, as someone who's lived over in the UK now for upwards of 17, 18 years, it seems to me, and we're going to get to this more later in the podcast, it seems to me the whole debate's maybe shifted a little bit. And what I found interesting, what I was not aware of, I mean, I'm old enough, and I was as listeners may know, I was a bit of a geeky news junkie as a little kid, so I remember things that kids that age should not remember. And I remember when there was a moratorium on the death penalty, and then it got reinstated, and, then you had this and then it sort of rapid increase in the use of the death penalty up until sort of 2000 era, and now it's kind of coming down again. But this whole dynamic of especially when it comes to lethal injection is an interesting one, and it seems to me that it's kind of shifting the debate a little bit. But before we go into that, I think let's go to let's maybe go back to sort of first principles. Why does the death penalty endure in the U.S.? I mean, there's 56 countries, mostly Asia and Africa, who still have the death penalty. Still use it. Even Russia is de facto abolitionists. They haven't used it in over 10 years. The U.S. is the only Western country to implement it regularly, although we've got countries like Japan and Singapore, where, in fact, Japan has broad support for it. And it's a topic that's come up in the Pope's visiting Japan right now, and it's come up. But let's get your insights. What do you think? Why does it endure in the U.S. and not elsewhere?
There's still significant public and political support for the death penalty in the United States. The death penalty has become very politicized, particularly in the last 30 to 40 years. And it's very difficult to be elected to any kind of significant office, state office, unless you have a record of being tough on crime. And that includes being quite strong on the death penalty. Now, there are massive regional variations, and those debates play much more successfully in the southern region and in parts of the Midwest than they do in other parts of the United States. But I think, even though opinion polls show that support for the death penalty is declining, and people are much more interested in alternatives such as life without parole with restitution, for example, there's still a lot of groundswell support for death sentences being imposed and executions being carried out. And I think any kind of hesitation can be quickly offset if there's a mass shooting or a particular heinous murder case that makes its way through the system. So I think it is simply a larger degree of public and political support in kind of key states such as Texas, Florida, Virginia, Oklahoma, those big active execution states.
I mean, we're going to talk about it later. We are going to talk a little bit more about the regional differences, but, I've got a colored-coded map here, and it looks like a map of the old Confederacy. Right. Mostly, with a few exceptions. Sure. And that's where it's still actively used. Elsewhere, there's either de facto moratoriums or proper moratoriums, or it's been abolished. But I think, to talk about this support, I think what the film does very well, it splits them up, but they're towards the beginning. I think it's about 12 minutes in. I think there's a good clip there where we see people express their reasons for why they support the death penalty, including one of the victims' daughters, who's plays a key. She's one of the main characters actually in this film, and how she feels about this. So let's watch that clip now.
He just shot her in the back of the head for no reason. It was just horrible. He's the one that saw my mom last. And that to me is so upsetting that that's the last person that she saw. That's why I want him to be put to death and just to get this over with.
What am I going to tell this man who lost his wife? What am I going to tell these daughters who lost their mother? I was a coward. I didn't care about your family. I didn't stop to think about the harm that I was doing. I know what I did was a very terrible and cowardly act.
will Don Davis's death achieve?
Probably nothing. You know, I mean, it's not going to prevent other people from killing. That's not how I look at it. It's truly to give the family, the people that loved her, peace. That's what it is for me.
And you think you will get that?
Oh, yeah.
So it's a very interesting clip. I think there's always a danger of catering to stereotypical views of people, and especially Americans, and views on the death penalty. But I think that's because what I will say, and maybe we'll hopefully have time later, there's also a second segment where they talk to people who, hey, for lack of a better way of putting it, seem like a bunch of rednecks who talk about all the reasons why they think it's wrong. You know, so I think it's an interesting. It's not so black and white, cut and dry of a topic. You've already. I mean, before we talk about why is it so prevalent in the South, especially. I mean, because it ties into this film. We've got guys who've been on death row for 25, 27 years. I mean, now the death penalty's been around again since 1976. There's been various. We won't bore you with all the. You know, we could do a whole litany of legal cases, but since Furman versus Georgia in '72, that's when they instituted the moratorium, and all these moratoriums were sort of it's more for legalistic reasons, less so than maybe sort of humanitarian a bit. There was a bit of the Eighth Amendment involved in that, but why? How are these guys allowed to just? Why are they sitting on death row for so long? I mean, if you've got states that are obviously have no qualms about doing the death penalty, why do they stay on death row for so long?
I know you need a governor to sign a death warrant to kind of get the case moving, and some governors are simply more cautious than others. They want the cases to go through the appellate process in a timely fashion. At various stages in a condemned person or an offender's criminal justice life, their case might be appealed. There might be consequences that have to be followed up from that appeal. Maybe the governor's not in a rush to sign a death warrant. There are all sorts of different factors, but it is an extraordinarily long, drawn-out process. And you get a situation, which I think is very well illustrated in this series, that the guys that are being executed are different people to the men, often young men, that committed these crimes 25, 27 years ago. And in many ways, they've kind of undergone a reformation or a rehabilitation within prison, which also can have quite strong moral consequences on the victim's family as well as their family, and the decision to kind of go ahead with the execution, etc.
And I think this series, I think it's a very good point. And one thing that would strike me is, some of these lawyers are making arguments, and you're like, you're only making this argument now about his mental state? Why wasn't that made 20 years ago? Or what? They're all trying to find techniques to just delay the execution by another whatever it is, so they can get beyond this deadline. Because what we'll talk about later is that the fact is, what's pushing this is that the state's supply of the drug, as you said, is expiring. I think
in some of the cases, and this is not just an Arkansas thing, there were problems with the original trials and convictions. There are notorious cases where defense lawyers have fallen asleep or been drunk during trial, and or the kind of mental competency of the defendant wasn't properly assessed, or various aspects about the kind of eyewitness testimony or the forensics have shown become problematic. And so those challenges kind of come later on in the process. So I think that's another reason why the process becomes elongated, if you like.
And I guess we've also got the advent of DNA and things, and you can find the Wikipedia lists of all the people. I think they're all men, but maybe there's a woman or two in there. But of all the inmates who were on death row who've now been exonerated, largely in many cases because of DNA evidence coming to light. And I think even that's how the moratorium in Illinois happened, because the governor kind of saw the light, if you will, and decided, wait a minute, there's too many of these didn't want it on his hands, basically.
And there's also the problem that in some cases you have defendants who have committed a crime together, but one person's ended up with a life sentence, the other person's ended up with a death sentence. So there are all sorts of issues around equity as well that have to be addressed during the appeals process.
Yeah, I think I think also what this film does is, whether the director knew he was getting this or not, the 8, at least what I've seen so far, are a very good representation of the different types of cases you're looking at, don't you think? Because there's some that are just, some it's very obvious. We know they're guilty. Some then later you find one's got mental issues, so he's a schizophrenic. Another one fits in that sort of DNA conversation. But he's also African American, which also is another element of this discussion.
Yes. I mean, there's no question that the death penalty is still applied differently in terms of kind of the racial dynamics. It's much more likely that a black defendant with a white victim will end up with a capital conviction, a death sentence, and an execution.
So I think African Americans are about 12% of the population, but they're something about a third or more of the men on death row.
Yes, 40%.
40%. Yeah. So yeah. I think on that note, we'll take a little break, but we'll be back shortly to further discuss this topic with Dr. Miller.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases and upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. And now, back to Factual America.
Welcome back to Factual America. Dr. Miller, we've been talking about Life and Death Row, this film, and sort of generally about the capital punishment and the death penalty in the United States. I think it'd be a good time this takes place in Arkansas, a state of the Old South. I mean, you've lived in Florida, I know. I mean, why is this still so prevalent in the South? What is it about the southern United States that makes them more likely to want to, use the death penalty?
I think there's a combination of historical and current factors. I mean, 2 of the major execution states, Texas and Florida, are in the deep South, and you've also got Oklahoma, Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, etc. They have long histories of being active execution states. And although there were moratoria in the 60s and the 1970s, in many ways they have not embraced those kind of moratorium arguments in the same way as the Northeast and the West, for example. I think there's a long legacy of kind of racial discrimination, racism in the criminal justice system, which has played out in many murder, rape, and other trials throughout the 19th, 20th, and into the 21st centuries. The southern region has the highest homicide rate of all the regions, and I think that's still important in people's calculations when it comes to the death penalty and death sentences and so on. The South in 2019 is a very different place to the South in 1959 or 1909.
Indeed.
It's been driven by huge Sunbelt growth in the last 50 to 60 years, large numbers of migrants, immigrants, that's changed the kind of politics from a kind of traditional one-party democratic state to, in some ways, very conservative Republican states. And the Republicans took up the mantle of kind of law and order politics very strongly in the 70s and 80s. And I think that combination of kind of long-term Democratic Party support for being tough on crime with a kind of insurgent conservative republicanism has kind of driven a lot of the political and public support for the death penalty and its retention in those southern states. I think the combination, as I said, with high homicide rates, kind of different racial, ethnic, immigration factors, all come into play in that region.
I think it's a very interesting point. I mean, over the years I've seen, I would say sometimes not very serious attempts to explain it, whether it's climate, being hotter, whether it's the fact that the South was traditionally Scotch-Irish immigration. I've seen all kinds of explanations, for why this could be. I mean, I think it would be good to even almost take a little bit of a step back, because what strikes me is, you can look at a map of the United States, and yes, technically 31 states out of the 50 are death penalty states. But then if you look at two things, states where there is actually abolition, I mean, it's not even a red-blue Trump, not Trump kind of thing. We've got Midwestern states like Michigan has never had a capital punishment case. You've got Iowa that's, you've got these states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan that have moratorium. You have Pennsylvania that has a a formal moratorium on it. Yet you've got even a more liberal state like Oregon that's kind of gone back and forth over the years. It's kind of there's an interesting sort of dynamic there. But we still have the 16 states that still practice it. Arkansas, it's very dominated by South, and being a Texan, I don't consider Texas part of the old South. But, that's just my own biases. But actually, Arkansas has now run out of the drugs.
Right.
So, I mean, I think this maybe even gets us to a point to look at where I think this has been this big change, this whole thing about how how capital punishment is implemented with this lethal injection, and how that is being playing out, and how it's taking a turn, especially with what's happening with Big Pharma on this. So could you tell us maybe a little something about sort of what's been happening in the last sort of 10, 15 years with this whole debate around lethal injection even?
So you need 3 drugs to carry out a lethal injection execution. And certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been major supply problems with 1 or 2 of the drugs, as pharmaceutical companies are not interested in having their drugs used for this purpose. As you might understand.
Yes.
The supply routes from Europe and other parts of the world have been curtailed largely through European Union restrictions and other restrictions. And so the states have increasingly relied on drugs that are difficult to obtain. And I don't know how much experimentation or research there is into kind of death penalty methods in the contemporary United States, but it does look like lethal injection is sort of at the end of its road in many respects. But we've kind of been here before, because the electric chair came in the 1890s as hanging was being discredited as a kind of old-fashioned, painful, unacceptable method of execution, although it does continue in the South.
It does.
In the 1910s and the 1920s.
Well, and there's even been one as recently as this is in August this year.
Yes, that's right.
A fellow in Tennessee, because we can go into that a little bit in a few minutes, but in some places they can choose their method.
They can choose the method, that's right. And then the electric chair was the dominant method for many states, particularly in the South, for much of the 20th century, although other states such as California and Mississippi opted for lethal gas, in the 1930s onwards. But lethal injection has been the main kind of method, I think, for the last 20 years. Some states did shift quite late from the electric chair to lethal injection, but it's always been seen as a kind of more modern, more humane method. But there's a lot of evidence that, as was shown in one of the episodes, that there are problems with lethal injection executions taking hours and being equally problematic as the electric chair or those other.
Well, I mean, maybe that brings us to the point that, so we know it's about this drug in this particular case in Arkansas, it's midazolam. But we've got the case in 2014 in Arizona, Joseph Wood. I mean, I think you've alluded to it, but the whole point of reason lethal injection came into being was that it was supposed to be the humane way. It was, you couldn't get more humane way, if there is such a thing, of putting someone to death. Yet like you said, there's probably not been much research into this, but we have the case of Joseph Wood, and I know they make some mention of some others where it was far from humane.
There have been a lot of botched lethal injection executions, problems with veins not being available, and inmates not reacting to the drugs in the way that was expected, etc. Some states have controversially experimented with 2 drugs. There's been moves to use 1 drug, etc. So I think they'll keep going with it as long as they can. But the line between cruel and unusual punishment and supposedly humane punishment is increasingly becoming blurred, I think.
And then this also, it gets back to the U.S. Constitution, does it? Because there is the 8th Amendment that says, if I'm correct, that you can't have cruel and unusual punishment.
That's right.
And so that's where all the arguments now, it's not whether a death penalty itself is cruel or unusual, but that the methods. And I think, is that where most of the legal battles are these days?
I think there are a lot of different aspects to the cruel and unusual punishment argument. There are arguments around the method, but also the way in which it's applied to specific groups of defendants or condemned men and women.
Yes, and indeed. I think before we get away from this part of the topic, I think this might not be a bad time to have one more clip from the film where there's a scene there where I think it's a advocacy group for abolition, and they're talking about Joseph Wood and his and there's a woman in the audience who talks about about that. So let's watch that clip now.
My name is Ferronda Brassfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Arkansas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And again, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today and showing your support for the cause to abolish the death penalty and to stop executions now. We are set to make history around the world for something that is atrocious, for an assembly line of executions. And we need to pull on the governor to ask him to have a change of heart.
Is this on? Yes. I think it is extremely likely that these executions, if they go forward, are going to go horribly wrong and are not going to end up the way the governor is expecting them to go. The rush to use this drug is, bad for the dignity that they're trying to do 8 and 10 days, but it's also a terrible idea because it's a terrible drug. A lot of the midazolam executions have gone wrong, and the problem is midazolam is not an anesthetic drug. In a surgical setting, it's used as a pre-anesthetic. It's a sedative. And so it cannot induce general anesthesia, which is how they're planning to use it or how they think it's going to work. But the second drug that's used paralyzes all the voluntary muscles in your body, including the muscles necessary to breathe. And so what happens is that the person feels like they're suffocating. It's called air hunger. And that's where you've seen these gasping, coughing, horrible deaths like Joseph Wood in Arizona, where it took 2 hours for him to die. A torturous, horrible death. So we shouldn't be in a hurry to use it.
Thank you.
It's pretty much like a slaughter line. I mean, there's no dignity at all in it. And it's just inhumane, the way they want to do that.
So, I mean, and I think as this film points, there's a lot of different ways of looking at this. We have the victims, we have those who are friends and family of the inmates and the perpetrators, but there's a lot of emotions. But I think that is a very good, regardless, that is a sort of horrific scene we have described there of how this man was put to death, far from being humane. And with that in mind, I mean, do you think that the tide is turning, or, and I hate to say it, but if it isn't, what is the future? What if it's not going to be lethal injection? If they're running out of drugs and people won't sell them, the big pharma won't sell them the drugs, what is the future of capital punishment in the U.S.?
Difficult to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the assumption is that there will be increasing numbers of states that will impose moratoria or will just stop executing. I mean, New York had the classic death penalty in the 90s when it reinstated the death penalty. Yeah. I think 300 people were sentenced to death, but no one was ever executed. Yeah. And then, of course, that statute was appealed. And maybe the modern death penalty is just to have people on death row for indefinite periods of time rather than actively executing. I mean, there will still be states, I think, such as Texas and possibly Oklahoma, that continue to try and carry out executions. But I think there's a lot of public support for looking at alternatives. But public support can be quite fickle. Yeah. It can change. And we may be in a situation 10 years' time where we're back in the late 1990s with executions rising and public support for that. So I think it's difficult to predict. Yeah. In the 60s, everyone thought the United States was heading toward abolition. It was falling in line with those other Western industrialized nations.
So it was about the same time Britain and... I think, is it even the 80s before France? I mean, France had the guillotine until...
Yeah, France was quite late.
Yeah.
But that changed within, a generation. Yeah. And so I think it's difficult to predict where the United States will be in 10 or 20 years' time. But certainly more politicians, more governors are becoming increasingly vocal about their moral and personal issues with the application of the death penalty and the kinds of problems around innocence, inequitable sentencing, racial factors, and are becoming much more or much bolder in their willingness to halt executions or to kind of put those questions out there for public debate.
Because indeed, the number of executions has been trending downward since about 2000. Quite sharply.
Quite sharply.
Yeah.
There was 98, I think, in 1999, and 25 last year.
Yes, I'm looking at a chart now, and that seems about right, yeah.
Which is a significant drop.
Yeah.
And most of those executions tend to be concentrated in a very small number of states. Yeah.
I mean, what strikes me, I mean, this is maybe going down a little bit of a tangent here, but we've got this, I'm looking at the same chart, and you're a historian, I know your specialties in the area you're in. Why, this thing, the death penalty, pretty level, but then you get to sort of the late 1800s up until sort of early 19th, well, middle of the 20th century. Why did it just it's almost go straight up? What was driving that? Do you have anything to say on what would you say about that?
In the United States, between about 1850 and 1950, I think there are different factors. So in the South, you have the end of the American Civil War, the abolition of slavery, and the use of criminal justice systems to control free black emancipated populations.
So lynchings would be in that?
No, legal executions. So you've got legal executions as well as lynchings as kind of quite striking, horrible methods of kind of racial control, intimidation and terror. There's a lot of public support for capital punishment in the late 19th, early 20th century. You've got kind of rising immigration, changing kind of economic, political communities, anxieties over kind of murder, other violent crimes, etc. And the way to control that, there's a lot of support for kind of quite draconian measures to do that. There's a regional shift in the early 20th century. A lot of the northern states become less willing to apply the death sentences and executions in comparison to the southern regions. So there are differences. But in the 1920s, 1930s, you've got the rise of prohibition and the kind of gang violence that accompanies that. in the 1930s, the kind of the war on crime against the bandits and the armed robbers and the kidnappers, etc. And again, a lot of support for kind of tough measures to deter those types of offender.
But then, because I'm trying to build almost see the arch of history here. So then sort of 1930s, 40s, it looks like, about the time of the Second World War, it just drops sharply.
Yes, it does.
Almost to nothing, even before the Supreme Court rules in 72. So what was, I guess what I'm trying to get is, are we at another inflection point? Maybe are we heading towards this, what you say, this de facto moratorium on the death penalty? Because it's happened, that has happened before.
Sure. I think the major factors from the 1940s, 50s and 60s relate to the kind of the end of World War II and kind of changing attitudes toward violence and the kind of use of violence to correct violence. So there's a lot of revulsion at particularly the use of lethal gas, even though some states are continuing to adopt that. But the other big factor is the rise of the civil rights movement, which drew attention to discriminatory practices, not just for African Americans, but also lower class white defendants. There's a whole kind of set of arguments in the 50s and 60s around the lack of legal representation for capital and non-capital defendants, the ways in which police conduct interrogations are under scrutiny. So all that kind of focus on civil rights translates into greater scrutiny of criminal justice systems and the ways in which lengthy sentences as well as death sentences are being imposed on particular groups of offender. There's a huge outcry at the discriminatory sentencing of rape defendants. There are very few southern states that convict white men of raping black women, but they're very willing to execute black men convicted of raping white women. So those kind of discriminatory practices are much more under scrutiny in the 50s and 60s. And I think also in the 60s, you've got the rise of kind of new ideas about how the law should work and how defendants should be represented more fairly in court. And all those things come into play in that time period.
And so as we've already talked about, then we had again this rise in the use of the death penalty up until, as you said, peaked in, I think, around 1999. It's been coming down sharply since then. And maybe we're at this as we've described it, possibly heading towards another period, if not actual abolition, of sort of de facto abolition, where even those states that want to implement it are maybe not even in a position where they can, either from just from a purely logistical standpoint, not being able to get their hands on the drugs that they need to implement, to carry out these sentences.
Sure. I think, though, that it's the exonerations that have really turned the tide in recent decades. And the fact that there are over 160 people who've been liberated from death row because it's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that their convictions were completely unsafe. I think that's led to a whole series of a lot of public worry about whether the death penalty is being applied properly. And I think one shouldn't underestimate the kind of power of that exoneration movement and the kind of related questions it poses about, the drugs, but also about whether the price of innocence, in many respects, is it better to save guilty people because you're fearful about executing the innocent, or should one sacrifice innocent people in the quest to demonstrate that we're tough on crime, that we need this deterrent, and all those other kind of law and order arguments.
And I think that nicely takes us back to the film itself, which I think for those of you who haven't seen it, I highly recommend. Not to give away the ending, but I can tell you one of the cases, I won't tell what everything that's happened, but I know one of the cases that it's still this whole idea of the DNA evidence is still playing out today, which is very topical in what we've been discussing. Again, this for those of you who are very interested in looking at this, I highly recommend Life and Death Row Mass Execution episode. Well, we looked at episode 1, but that's just the first of a 4-parter. And I wanted to also thank Dr. Miller for coming on to the podcast. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you. No, it's a weighty topic to be discussing at this on Saturday morning, but we do very much appreciate it for our listeners and viewers, actually, because we're on video as well. If you're keeping track, you may have noticed that things might look a little different. So a little shout out to Soho Radio for hosting us here, and again to remind you that wherever you happen to listen to podcasts, please remember to like us and share us with your friends. And without further ado, this is Factual America signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guest, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, festivals we're attending, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.